contract.
Chairman.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. Mr Chairman, in this committee stage of the debate, we're going to be looking at Part 2. I'm going to do that firstly by recalling very briefly the structural context of the policy, the focus on the UFB connections, and then to go through key issues which are raised in Part 2A and Part 2, and to look at the SOP. So, Mr Chairman, I hope you'll bear with me as I hopefully go through that in a reasonable, logical way. The first level of the context, sir, is the strategic context of what's being trying to be achieved here. The government was elected with a mandate to roll out fibre to the home to 75% of the population using a promise of 1.5 billion of Crown subsidy, or so it seemed. It turned out it wasn't a subsidy. It was an investment at a commercial rate of return, and that caused some issues because, of course, the industry responded that it wasn't possible to roll out that much fibre to that many people at the amount of money the government was offering, given that it wanted to make a profit off it through Crown Fibre Holdings. And so the government then took nearly 3 years, Mr Chairman, to go through contortions to work out a way of watering down the regulatory framework to a point where the market, or at least one player in the market, would find that it could make enough of the regulatory change to supplement the meagre offering of the Crown. Crown, in this case, as in other cases, was essentially selling the framework, selling the law in favour of whoever won the contract to enable it to make higher levels of profit. And I've got to, as I've done before, give some credit to Sir Roger Douglas, who at the Finance and Expenditure Committee actually got the officials to put a number on that, $400 to $600 million of additional subsidy through regulatory dilution. And there were a number of issues which we won't rehearse in this part of the committee stage debate, upon which the Select Committee debate turned. Principal amongst those, one of probably a half a dozen key issues, was the regulatory forbearance period, so-called the regulatory holiday, which meant the Crown's regulator, the Commerce Commission, would simply be unable to look at unbundled fibre contracts, ultra-fast broadband contracts, for a period of 10 years or 8.5 years from the implementation of this bill, which of course got the whole industry up in arms, and the Minister, Stephen Joyce, standing in a very lonely minority of two, the other one being the incumbent telco, Telecom, who were deeply worried that the whole regulatory framework would be set backwards. And so indeed it has proven to be, as we've seen data released just recently that shows New Zealand cascading down the international broadband ratings, having clawed its way up in the preceding 5 years, collapsing down again, really tumbling down the rankings. No surprise that in the 3 years it took Stephen Joyce to make up his mind which way was up and get a bill to the House, New Zealand's been on a broadband plummet. So it's been USB, ultra-slow broadband, or at least an ultra-slow bill coming to this House. And then, of course, there was a bit of sleight of hand on the regulatory forbearance period where the Māori Party, either by waking up after the Select Committee process was over, because they didn't often turn up and didn't say boo to a goose when they were there.
Order. I just remind the member we're on Part 2. This is not a critique of what's happened in other parts. Part 2 is very specific. It's inserting new Part 4 AAA. That's what we're on, and that's what I'll ask the member to come back to.
My information, sir, is that Part 2 of the bill covers the regulatory forbearance period, and that's exactly what I'm talking about, because it was that which, in discussions between the Māori Party and the Minister, was apparently struck out.
Look, I just mentioned Part 2. It's got nothing to do about the Māori Party, and I'll ask the member to come back to Part 2.
Speaker, the regulatory forbearance period, which was at the heart of Part 2, ran not nearly as nasty as that little minister on the far side. What a nasty little man he is. Can't get through a debate on an unrelated bill without nasty little comments in the House. Shame, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the regulatory forbearance period is at the heart of Part 2 of the bill. And it's intriguing that it was struck out of the bill after discussions between the Minister and the Maori Party. Now, what's intriguing about that was the Maori Party didn't appear to take a position on that issue at all during the Select Committee process and voted with the government at every point. So it's intriguing that it should have changed its position subsequently, and the question's been asked publicly whether in fact they were invited to change their position by a minister who'd realised that he was indeed isolated in public opinion and wanted a way off the lonely branch that he was on. But that being the case or not, we guess we'll never know for sure. The public will never know for sure, because that's precisely the point. This has not been a good legislative process, Mr. Chairman.
Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Chairman, this has not been a good process. This has been a process of inadequate transparency with last-minute legislation rushed to the House, rushed through a Select Committee process, and then a very substantive SOP, and we're looking today at SOP 247, brought to the House to make late amendments that the Select Committee didn't consider, that the industry and the public were not invited to submit upon, and this House is now being asked to give a judgment on such matters without the benefit of submissions from the industry. And the issue, sir, is that these changes are very long-lasting changes. They go to the heart of the intelligent infrastructure of this country. They will last a generation of human time, 5 to 10 generations of ICT technology, and, sir, we're being asked to do this job without Select Committee consideration that is adequate. Mr. Chairman, let me just take a dive down, if you like, to several of the issues that are related here. And as my colleague Claire Curran has said, the open access regime is at the heart of this. I want to cover two parts of it. Firstly, what replaced the regulatory holiday? The regulatory holiday was obviously outrageous. To take the Commerce Commission off the job for a decade was never, in common sense terms, going to be a starter. But to replace it with an indemnity by taxpayers' funds to the profit of the incumbent entity has got to be adding insult to injury. Not only is the competitive framework of the industry done grievous bodily harm by this legislation, but the incumbent gets a taxpayer-funded get-out-of-jail-free card. Now, Labour's position on that is we will restore regulatory oversight, and it then will be a matter between the Commerce Commission and all players in the industry as to how they fare under the appropriate regulatory purview. And if they have to have compliance measures or if they face penalties, that is a matter for them. On the open access regime, Mr. Chairman, that means that service providers would allow retailers non-discriminatory access on what should be, as my colleague Claire Curran has said, an equivalence of inputs basis. That means the same stuff produced at the same price in the same way, so that there is zero possibility of vertical integration and discrimination between the component parts of Chorus 2. Now, why have I said Chorus 2? Because I agree with the Minister and with the government that those issues are now less important between the retail business, what is called Telco 2 or Newco, and Chorus 2. The problem now exists in Chorus 2 between the wholesale and network and access layers, the main backbone of the system, because we don't have equivalence of inputs at all layers, not at layer 0, not at layer 1 on fibre, and that means discrimination is possible between internal parts of Chorus 2. And Mr. Speaker, the supplementary order paper talks about discontinuance of accounting separation in section 23 GDC. We had accounting and functional separation between the two key boxes that now reside within Chorus 2, the access layer and the wholesale layer. Those bits have been brought together without appropriate transparency, regulatory oversight or arm's length provisions, and that puts the wholesale end of the industry at risk. Let me put that in really simple terms for the public. if you are buying telecommunication services from a provider other than Chorus, they will have had to have bought those services wholesale from Chorus at a price that we now have no guarantee will be a fair and equitable price between other parts of Chorus and the rest of the market. In other words, the citizen, the punter if you like, the account holder, whether purchasing at that wholesale level or passed on down to retail, may well be paying too much, and the dominant wholesaler, now cross-subsidised by this Crown investment, may well find itself able to make supernormal profits at the expense of the consumer. In other words, within Chorus, a return to the darker days. Mr. Chairman, there is a very, very great deal of concern in the industry.
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Chair, if I could just take a call to